Chapter 6. Duncan led his men as they galloped through the moonlit night, across the snowy plains of Escalon, hour passing hour as they charged, somewhere on the horizon for Andros. The night ride brought back memories of past battles, of his time in Andros, of serving the old king. He found himself getting lost in thoughts, memories blending with the present, blending with fantasies for the future, until he no longer knew what was real. As usual, his thoughts drifted to his daughter. Kira, where are you? He wondered. Duncan prayed she was safe, that she was advancing in her training, and that they would soon reunite for good. Would she be able to summon Theos again, he wondered? If not, he did not know if they could win this war that she had begun. The incessant sound of horses, of armor, filled the night. Duncan barely feeling the cold, his heart warm from their victory, from their momentum, from the growing army behind him, and from anticipation. Finally, after all these years, he felt the tide turning his way again. He knew Andros would be heavily guarded with a sitting professional army, that they would be vastly outnumbered, that the capital would be fortified, and that they did not have the manpower to stage a siege. He knew that the battle of his life awaited him, one that would determine the fate of Escalon. Yet that was the weight of honor. Duncan also knew that he and his men had cause on his side, had desire, purpose, and most of all, speed and the power of surprise. The Pandesians would never expect an attack on the capital, not by a subjugated people, and certainly not at night. Finally, as the first traces of dawn began to break, the sky still a bluish haze, Duncan saw in the distance, just beginning to appear, the familiar contours of the capital. It was a sight he had not expected to see again in his lifetime, and one that made his heart beat faster. Memories rushed back of all the years he had lived there, had served the king and the land loyally. He recalled Escalon in the height of its glory, a proud, free nation, one that had seemed undefeatable. Yet seeing it also brought back bitter memories, the weak king's betrayal of his people, his surrendering of the capital, of Escalon. He recalled he and all the great warlords dispersing, being forced to leave in shame, all exiled to their own strongholds all across Escalon. Seeing the majestic contours of the city brought rushing back to him longing and nostalgia and fear and hope all at the same moment. Those were the contours that had shaped his life, the outline of the most magnificent city in Escalon, ruled by kings for centuries, stretching so far it was hard to see where they ended. Duncan breathed deep as he saw the familiar parapets and domes and spires, all of which were deeply ingrained in his soul. In some ways, it was like returning home, except Duncan was not the defeated, loyal commander he had once been. Now he was stronger, willing to answer to no one, and he had an army in tow. In the breaking dawn, the city was still lit by torches, the remnant of the night's watch, just beginning to shake off the long night in the morning mist. And as Duncan neared, another sight came into view which made his heart churn. The blue and yellow banners of Pandesia flying proudly over the battlements of Andros. It made him sick and gave him a fresh wave of determination. Duncan immediately scanned the gates, and his heart soared to see it was guarded by only a skeleton crew. He breathed a sigh of relief. If the Pandesians knew they were coming, thousands of soldiers would be guarding it, and Duncan and his men would stand no chance. But that told him they did not know. The thousands of Pandesian soldiers stationed there must still be asleep. Duncan and his men, luckily, had advanced quickly enough to just have a chance. This element of surprise, Duncan knew, would be their only advantage, the only thing giving them a chance to take the massive capital with its layers of battlements designed to withstand an army. That, and Duncan's insider knowledge of its fortifications and weak points. Battles, he knew, had been won with less. Duncan studied the city's entrance and knew where he'd have to attack first if they stood any chance of victory. "Whoever controls those gates controls the capital," Duncan shouted to Kavos and his other commanders. "They must not close. We cannot let them close, whatever it costs. If they do, we shall be sealed out for good. I will take a small force with me and make with all speed for the gates. You," he said, gesturing to Kavos, Bramthos, and Sivig, "lead the rest of our men to the garrisons and protect our flank against the soldiers as they emerge." Kavos shook his head. "Charging those gates with a small force is reckless," he shouted. "You'll be surrounded, and if I am fighting the garrisons, I cannot protect your back. It's suicide." Duncan smiled. "And that is why I chose this task for myself." Duncan kicked his horse and rode out before the others, heading for the gates, while Anvin, Artfail, and a dozen of his closest commanders, men who knew Andros as well as he, men he had fought with his entire life, rode to follow him, as he knew they would. They all veered for the city gates at full speed, while behind them, Duncan saw out of the corner of his eye Kavos, Bramthos, Sivig, and the bulk of their army veer off for the Pandesian garrisons. Duncan, heart slamming, knowing he had to reach the gate before it was too late, lowered his head and urged his horse faster. They galloped down the center of the road, over King's Bridge, the hooves clopping on the wood, and Duncan felt the thrill of battle drawing near. As dawn broke, Duncan saw the startled face of the first Pandesian to spot them, a young soldier standing guard sleepily on the bridge, blinking, looking out, his face spreading with terror. Duncan closed the gap, reached him, brought down his sword, and in one swift move slashed him before he could raise his shield. The battle had begun. Anvin, Artfail, and the others hurled spears, felling a half-dozen Pandesian soldiers who turned their way. They all continued to gallop, none of them pausing, all of them knowing it meant their life. They raced over the bridge just like that, all charging for the wide-open gates to Andros. Still a good 100 yards away, Duncan looked up at the legendary gates of Andros, 100 feet high, carved of gold, 10 feet thick, and he knew that if sealed, the city would be impregnable. It would take professional siege equipment, none of which he had, and many months and many men pounding at the gates, which he did not have either. Those gates had never given, despite centuries of assaults. If he did not reach them in time, all was lost. Duncan surveyed the mere dozen Pandesian soldiers guarding it, the guard duty light, the men sleepy at dawn and none expecting an attack, and he urged his horse faster, knowing his time was limited. He had to reach them before they spotted him. He needed but one more minute to assure his survival. Suddenly, though, a great horn sounded, and Duncan's heart dropped as he looked up to see, high atop the parapets, a Pandesian watchman staring down, sounding a horn of warning again and again. The sound echoed throughout the city walls, and Duncan's heart sank as he knew that any advantage he may have had was lost. He had underestimated the enemy. The Pandesian soldiers at the gate broke into action. They rushed forward and put their shoulders into the gates, 6 men on each side, pushing with all their might to close them. At the same time, 4 more soldiers turned massive cranks on either side, while 4 more pulled at chains, 2 on each side. With a great creaking, the bars began to shut. Duncan watched with desperation, feeling as if they were shutting a coffin on his heart. "Faster!" he urged his horse. They all picked up speed in one final mad dash. As they neared, a few of his men hurled spears at the men at the gate in a desperate effort, but they were still too far, and the spears fell short. Duncan urged his horse like never before, riding out recklessly before the others, and as he neared the closing gates, he suddenly felt something whiz by him. He realized it was a javelin, and he looked up to see soldiers atop the parapets hurling them downward. Duncan heard a cry and looked over to see one of his men, a brave warrior he had fought beside for years, impaled and go flying backwards off his horse, dead. Duncan pushed harder, throwing caution to the wind as he aimed for the closing doors. He was perhaps 20 yards away, and the doors were just feet away from closing forever. No matter what, even if it meant his own death, he could not let that happen. In a final suicide charge, Duncan threw himself off his horse, diving for the open crack just as the gates were closing. He reached out with his sword, and as he did, he thrust it forward, and he managed to jam it in the crack just before it closed. His sword bent, but did not break. That slice of steel, Duncan knew, was the only thing keeping those gates from closing for good, the only thing keeping the capital open, the only thing keeping all of Escalon from being lost. The shocked Pandesian soldiers, realizing their gate wasn't closing, looked down at Duncan's sword, amazed. They charged, all rushing for it, and Duncan knew that even if it cost his life, he could not let that happen. Still winded from his fall from his horse, his ribs aching, Duncan tried to roll out of the way of the first soldier pouncing for him, but he could not move quickly enough. He saw the raised sword behind him and braced himself for the deadly blow, when suddenly the soldier cried out, and Duncan turned, puzzled, as he heard a neighing and saw his warhorse leaning back and kicking his foe in the chest, right before he could stab Duncan. The soldier went flying back, ribs cracking, and landed on his back, unconscious. Duncan looked up at his horse with gratitude, realizing that he had, once again, saved his life. Given the time he needed, Duncan rolled to his feet, drew his spare sword, and prepared as the group of soldiers descended upon him. The first soldier slashed down at him with his sword, and Duncan blocked it overhead, spun around, and slashed him across the back of the shoulder, sending him to the ground. Duncan stepped forward and stabbed the next soldier in the gut before he could reach him, then jumped over his falling body and with both feet kicked the next one in the chest, knocking him to his back. He ducked as another soldier swung for him, then spun around and slashed him in the back. Duncan, distracted by his attackers, spun as he sensed motion behind him, and saw a Pandesian grabbing the sword wedged between the gates and yanking it out by its hilt. Realizing there was no time, Duncan turned, took aim, and threw his sword. It spun end over end and lodged itself in the man's throat, right before he could extract his long sword. He had saved the gate, but it had left him defenseless. Duncan charged for the gate, hoping to widen the crack, but as he did, a soldier tackled him from behind and drove him down to the ground. His back exposed, Duncan knew he was in danger. There was little he could do as the Pandesian behind him raised a spear high to impale his back. A shout filled the air as Duncan saw out of the corner of his eye Anvin rush forward, swinging his mace, and smashed the soldier on his wrist, knocking the spear from his hand just before it impaled Duncan. Anvin then jumped off his horse and tackled the man down to the ground, and at the same time, Artfail and the others arrived, attacking the other group of soldiers heading for Duncan. Freed up, Duncan took stock and saw the soldiers guarding the gate were dead, the gate barely being kept open by his sword, and as he saw out of the corner of his eye hundreds of Pandesian soldiers beginning to emerge from the barracks in the dawn and rush out to fight Kavos, Bramthos, Sivik, and their men, he knew time was short. Even with Kavos and his men engaging them, enough would slip through and make their way for the gate, and if Duncan did not control these gates soon, all of his men would be finished. Duncan dodged as yet another spear was hailed down upon him from the parapets. He rushed over and grabbed a bow and arrow from a felled soldier, leaned back, took aim, and fired at a Pandesian high at the top as he leaned over and looked down with the spear. The boy shrieked and fell, impaled by the arrow, clearly not expecting that. He plummeted down to earth and landed beside Duncan with a crash, Duncan stepping out of the way so as not to be killed by the body. Duncan took particular satisfaction to see this boy was the hornblower. "The gates!" Duncan shouted to his men as they finished felling the remaining soldiers. His men rallied, dismounting, rushing up beside him and helping him yank open the massive gates. They yanked with all their might, yet they barely budged. More of his men joined in, and as they all yanked together, slowly, one began to move. 1 inch at a time it opened, and soon there was enough space for Duncan to put his foot in the gap. Duncan squeezed his shoulders in the gap, and he pushed with all his might, grunting, arms shaking. Sweat poured down his face, despite the morning cold, as he looked out and saw the flood of soldiers streaming out of the garrison. Most faced off with Kavos, Bramthos, and their men, but enough skirted around them and headed his way. A sudden shriek rang through the dawn, and Duncan saw one of his men beside him, a good commander, a loyal man, fall to the ground. He saw a spear in his back, and he looked up to see the Pandesians were in throwing range. More Pandesians raised their spears to hurl their way, and Duncan braced himself, realizing they were not going to make it through the gate in time. When suddenly, to his surprise, the soldiers stumbled and fell face first. He looked up to see the arrows and swords in their backs, and he felt a rush of gratitude to see Bramthos and Sivig leading 100 men, forking off from Kavos, who faced off with the garrison, and turning back to aid him. Duncan redoubled his efforts, pushing with all his might as Anvin and Artfail squeezed in beside him, knowing he had to get the gap wide enough for his men to charge through. Finally, as more of his men squeezed in, they dug their feet into the snowy ground and began to walk. Duncan took step after step, until finally, with a groaning, the gates opened halfway. There came a victorious shout behind him, and Duncan turned to see Bramthos and Sivig, leading the 100 men forward on horseback, all of them rushing for the open gate. Duncan retrieved his sword, raised it high and charged, leading the men through the open gates, stepping foot inside the capital, throwing all caution to the wind. With spears and arrows still raining down on them, Duncan knew at once that they had to gain control of the parapets, which were also equipped with catapults which could do unlimited damage to his men below. He looked up at the battlements, debating the best way to ascend, when suddenly he heard another shout and looked ahead to see a large force of Pandesian soldiers rallying from within the city and charging their way. Duncan faced them boldly. "Men of Escalon, who has inhabited our precious capital?" he shouted. His men all shouted and charged behind him as Duncan remounted his horse and led them to greet the soldiers. There followed a great clash of arms as soldier met soldier, horse met horse, and Duncan and his 100 men attacked the 100 Pandesian soldiers. Duncan sensed that the Pandesians were caught off guard in the dawn, had smelled blood in the water when they had spotted Duncan and his few men, but had not expected such a huge number of reinforcements behind Duncan. He could see their eyes widen at the sight of Bramthos, Sivig, and all their men pouring through the city gates. Duncan raised his sword and blocked a sword slash, stabbed a soldier in the gut, spun and bashed another in the head with his shield, then grabbed the spear from his harness and hurled it at another. He cut a path fearlessly through the crowd, felling men left and right, as all around him, Anvin, Artfail, Bramthos, Sivig, and their men did the same. It felt good to be back inside the capital again, these streets he once knew so well, and it felt even better to be ridding it of Pandesians. Soon, dozens of Pandesians piled up at their feet, all unable to stop the tide of Duncan and his men, like a wave crashing through the capital at dawn. Duncan and his men had too much at stake, had come too far, and these men guarding these streets were far from home, demoralized, their cause weak, their leaders far away, and unprepared. After all, they had never met in battle the true warriors of Escalon. As the tide turned, the Pandesian soldiers who remained turned and fled, giving up, and Duncan and his men rode faster, hunting them down, felling them with arrows and spears, until there was none left. With the path into the capital cleared, and with arrows and spears still hailing down, Duncan turned and focused again on the parapets, as another one of his men fell from his horse, an arrow through his shoulder. They needed the parapets, the high ground, not only to stop the arrows, but to aid Kavos. After all, Kavos was still outnumbered out there, beyond the walls, and he would need Duncan's help at the parapets with the catapults if he were to stand any chance of surviving. "To the heights!" Duncan shouted. Duncan's men cheered and followed as he signaled to them, forking off, half following him and half following Bramthos and Sivig to the far side of the courtyard, to ascend from the other side. Duncan headed for the stone steps that lined the side walls leading to the upper parapets. Guarding them were a dozen soldiers, and they looked up wide-eyed at the coming assault. Duncan bore down on them, and he and his men hurled spears, killing them all before they could even raise their shields. There was no time left to waste. They reached the steps, and Duncan dismounted and led the charge, single file, up the steps. He looked up with a start to see Pandesian soldiers running down to greet him, spears raised high, ready to throw. He knew they would have the advantage racing downward, and not wanting to waste time in hand-to-hand combat as spears were hailing down upon him. He thought quick. "Arrows!" Duncan commanded the men behind him. Duncan ducked, hitting the ground, and a moment later, he felt arrows whiz overhead as his men followed his command, stepping forward and firing. Duncan looked up and watched in satisfaction as the group of soldiers racing down the narrow stone staircase stumbled and fell off the side of the steps, crying out as they plummeted and landed on the stone courtyard far below. Duncan continued running up the steps, tackling a soldier as more came charging and knocking him over the edge. He spun around and bashed another with his shield, sending him flying too, then came straight up with his sword and stabbed another through the chin. But that left Duncan vulnerable on the narrow staircase, and a Pandesian jumped him from behind and dragged him to the edge. Duncan held on for dear life, clawing at the stone, unable to grab hold and about to fall over, when suddenly the man atop him went limp and slumped over his shoulder, over the edge, dead. Duncan saw a sword in his back, and he turned to see Artfail lifting him back to his feet. Duncan continued charging, grateful to have his men at his back, and he ascended level after level, avoiding spears and arrows, blocking some with his shield, until finally he reached the parapets. At the top sat a broad stone plateau, perhaps 10 yards wide, spanning the top of the gates, and it was packed with Pandesian soldiers, shoulder to shoulder, all armed with arrows, spears, javelins, and all in the midst of raining down weapons on Kavos's men below. As Duncan arrived with his men, they stopped attacking Kavos and instead turned to fight him. At the same time, Sivig and the other contingent of men finished scaling the steps on the far side of the courtyard and attacked the soldiers from the far end. They were sandwiching them in, with nowhere to go. The fighting was thick, hand to hand, as men on all sides fought for every precious inch. Duncan raised his shield and his sword, and as clanging filled the air, the fighting bloody, hand to hand, he hacked through one man at a time. Duncan dodged, avoiding slashes, and lowered his shoulder and shoved more than one man over the edge, shrieking to his death far below, knowing that sometimes one's best weapons were one's hands. He cried out in pain as he received a slash in the stomach, but luckily he twisted and it grazed him. As the soldier came in for a death blow, Duncan, with no room to maneuver, head-butted him, making him drop his sword. Then he kneed him, reached over, grabbed hold of him and threw him over the edge. Duncan fought and fought, every foot hard won, as the sun rose higher and the sweat stung his eyes. His men grunted and cried out in pain on all sides as Duncan's shoulders grew tired with killing. As he gasped for breath, covered in his foe's blood, Duncan took one final step forward and raised his sword, and was shocked to see Bramthos and Sivig and their men facing him. He turned and surveyed all the dead bodies, and realized, amazed, that they had done it. They had cleared the parapets. There arose a shout of victory, as all their men met in the middle. Yet Duncan knew the situation was still urgent. "Arrows!" he shouted. He immediately looked down at Kavos's men and saw a great battle being waged below in the courtyard as thousands more Pandesian soldiers rushed out of the garrisons to meet them. Kavos was slowly being surrounded on all sides. Duncan's men raised their bows from the fallen, took aim over the walls, and fired down at the Pandesians, Duncan joining in. The Pandesians never expected to be fired upon from the capital, and they fell by the dozens, dropping to the ground. Kavos's men spared from deathly blows. Pandesians began to drop all around Kavos, and soon a great panic ensued as they realized Duncan controlled the heights. Sandwiched between Duncan and Kavos, they had nowhere left to flee. Duncan would not give them time to regroup. "Spears!" he commanded. Duncan grabbed one himself and hurled it down, then another and another, raiding the huge reserve of weapons left here atop the parapets designed to fend off invaders of Andros. As the Pandesians began to waver, Duncan knew he had to do something definitive to finish them off. "Catapults!" he yelled. His men rushed to the catapults left atop these battlements and pulled on the great ropes, turning cranks as they got them into position. They placed the boulders inside and awaited his command. Duncan walked up and down the line and adjusted positions so that the boulders would miss Kavos's men and find the perfect target. "Fire!" he called out. Dozens of boulders flew through the air, and Duncan watched with satisfaction as they plummeted down and battered the stone garrisons, killing dozens of Pandesians at a time as they poured out like ants to fight Kavos's men. The sounds echoed throughout the courtyard, stunning the Pandesians and increasing their panic. As clouds of dust and debris arose, they turned and turned, unsure which way to fight. Kavos, veteran warrior that he was, took advantage of their hesitation. He rallied his men and charged forward with a new momentum, and while the Pandesians wavered, he hacked his way through their ranks. Bodies fell left and right, the Pandesian camp in disarray, and soon they turned and fled in every direction. Kavos hunted each and every one down. It was a slaughter. By the time the sun had fully risen, all the Pandesians lay on the ground, lifeless. As silence fell, Duncan looked out, stunned, filled with a dawning sense of victory, as he began to realize that they had done it. They had taken the capital. As his men shouted all around him, clasping his shoulders, cheering and embracing, Duncan wiped the sweat from his eyes, still breathing hard, and began to let it sink in. Andros was free. The capital was theirs.